Okay, so I was told I have to speak from this mic, sort of like a dog tethered. I don't think I'm going to do this. We need 2 mics, and we've only got 1 portable mic. But let me just tell you why you might be interested. You know, it's a rather dry subject on its surface at the end of the day, and it's very complicated. I'm the best person to try to interpret it because I'm the lowest common denominator with scientific knowledge. So I'm still learning all of this, and I'm going to have to learn it well through people like Robin. But I'll introduce her in a second. But I want to tell you why this might be important to you as lawyers. And the short answer is there's going to be a lot of court-appointed cases. They're going to come out of this huge mess. I don't know, how many of you have even heard about this problem? Okay, most of you. If you remember Tropical Storm Allison and how it shut down the courthouse and what fun that was, it was great fun. I mean, the whole system was a mess for a while. This is gonna be much worse in a way. Okay, so it should be great fun. Basically, just to give you an idea, what's going on right now is there are all these cases that Robin will talk about where DNA mixtures were calculated in a way that now they're thinking they shouldn't have been. And so there's recalculation that must be done, not retesting of samples, but recalculation that has to be done. And this has all created quite a storm at the Forensic Science Commission in Austin. And they are they're putting together all these panels to examine the issue. One of the panels will be all the conviction integrity unit people from Bexar County, Tarrant County, Dallas County, and Harris County, defense lawyers, even some legislative people. There will be some prosecutors like Jack Rody on there to determine how to approach this mess. And we got an initial list of cases affected from the DPS, which is usually about half of the statewide number of cases, and the list is 25,000 cases. So those will be pared down somewhat, but even if they're pared down by half, and even if there are other ways of filtering it, you're going to have tens of thousands of cases that will need to be reviewed. And in order to review them, and we'll get to this later if we have time, but what's going to ultimately shake out of all of this is that money will be put into court-appointed lawyers being needed for Chapter 64 motions for DNA testing. And we will talk about that. There are all sorts of complicated issues here. But the bottom line for you is there may be a lot of cases that need court-appointed lawyers for Chapter 64 motions. Our office, in conjunction with TCDLA, ACCLA, and so forth, we will be getting together all the training, all the motions, all the legal memorandum, all the arguments. We can tell everybody the ideal way to go, the conceded way to go. And we're even going to talk to prosecutors about what we can agree on as to what types of procedural vehicles to employ here. The advantage of a Chapter 64 motion is you have a right to counsel. You don't on a writ. These can be filed arguably under either avenue, but Chapter 64 is the way we want to go, so we can get a lot of people appointed on these cases. So I want to introduce the person who can answer all your questions about the science aspect of this. Robin Guidry is the technical leader, the DNA technical leader of the Forensic Biology Unit of the Houston Forensic Science Center. She can answer all your questions about this, and I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can y'all hear me in the back? Okay, great.
Robin, should we encourage them to jump in and ask questions along the way? Because sometimes, I don't know about y'all, but I get lost with some of the terms.
Please, thank you for asking. Please do ask questions. I am going to cover a lot of boring science stuff. I did my best to try to have some pictures and break things up, but bear with me and please do ask questions as I go along. So as Bob said, I'm with the Houston Forensic Science Center. For those who don't already know, back in May, the FBI came out and published an erratum saying some of the frequencies that us labs have been using since 1999 might have had some slight discrepancies. The overall effect should not impact cases much, but they felt it was still worth mentioning to the community that there were these discrepancies. So according to the FBI, here are some of the facts surrounding the discrepancies. So the initial population data was generated in the 1990s. And like I said, we labs have been using it since 1999 for our statistical analyses. And for those who don't know, the forensic community is about to expand the DNA STR markers that we examine. Currently, there are 13 core locations. What that means is every single lab in the United States looks at the same 13 core regions. The reason that's important is so that we can compare data from lab to lab, right? If we're all looking at different regions, it wouldn't be helpful to compare. We couldn't have a national database. Currently, at a minimum, we must look at the same 13, but we're about to expand that to 20. The reason the FBI is expanding it is because we're becoming more global. We want to be able to compare to the rest of the world, but also they want to make sure they minimize adventitious matches within the database. So in this process of bringing on these additional markers, they were comparing the new data to the original data, and that's where these discrepancies were discovered. Some of the issues or some of the errors are due to the fact that there are these rare genetic variations that when tested with one kit, it might not have been detected, but with this new kit, it is being picked up. But some of the errors are also because of clerical. They're manually entering this data, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of bits of information. So because it was manual, there were some clerical errors. But then also technology has improved. And so the next slide I'm going to show you just to give you an image of that. But to give you some perspective, it's 51 incorrect alleles out of 30,000, right? So this is not, at the surface, not a significant issue. Allele. Thank you. And I have a slide, a definition slide, but I should have put it before this. An allele is, if you've seen a DNA report and you see a DNA profile in one of our reports, those numbers that get reported, that is a bit of genetic information that varies within the population. You would get one allele from your biological mother, one from your biological father. And so those numbers represent that genetic information. That's what we examine in forensics. In forensics, we look at regions of DNA that vary from person to person. Over 99% of our DNA is the same because we're all human. We don't care about that DNA. We look at those regions that vary, and in those regions, we look at these allele markers, and those differ from person to person. And so when we have a profile from a crime scene, we compare it to a known source of DNA and determine could they be from the same individual or not. If the information doesn't match, that's not your donor. If it does match, then you would then do statistical analyses. And I'm going to talk more about that later. Thank you. So to give you, I was thinking I was going to have a bigger screen. Some of these slides are going to be hard to read, so I do apologize. But on the left-hand side is an image of DNA testing back in the early 1990s. On the right-hand side, kind of hard to see, but this is the type of data that we examine today. It's much more discrete and easily detected and interpreted. So that is part of the issue of why these discrepancies occurred.
So Robin, just so I understand, those lines going up are the alleles?
Correct.
Okay. And when you get an allelic table, when lawyers look at one of these charts, you're looking to see if your client's numbers, the two numbers, appear at the various ladders or loci of the DNA mixture from the evidence sample.
Correct.
Is that right?
So we'll test an evidence sample. We'll develop a DNA profile, which is a combination of all these alleles or numbers. And then we would test a known source of DNA. Bless you. And if the same numbers appear at those locations, you mentioned loci. A loci is plural for locus. Locus is just the specific region of DNA being tested. It's like the address of the DNA of where we're testing this DNA. If the numbers are consistent between the evidence sample and the reference sample, your conclusion would then be, I cannot exclude this person. This person could be a donor. If it doesn't match 100%, it's not that person because your DNA doesn't change over time.
And that's usually accompanied, as I understand it, they'll say, this profile of these 13 ladders or whatever occurs at random 1 out of every 16 quadrillion times or whatever. And by the way, your defendant has the same numbers, so what are the odds that anyone else could have been a contributor, and the odds are, I mean, nobody in a million universes, so it's him. So that's how you match it up, right?
Right. Once we do that comparison, and if the profiles are consistent, we'll do statistics. And the idea is to give you an understanding of, okay, does it match because it's a really common profile and lots of people would also have it? Or does it match because it's so rare that you would not expect any other person on this planet or 17 billion Earths to also have this DNA profile? But the reason we're never going to get up here and say it's him and only him, can't be anybody else, a couple of reasons. One, identical twins will have the same DNA profile. So right off the bat, somebody else, if they have an identical twin, will also match that profile. But number two is we have not tested everybody on the planet, nor will we test everybody on the planet. So there's no way we can 100% tell you, we've tested everybody, it doesn't match anybody else, this is the only person it matches. That's never going to happen. So like you said, we'll provide you the statistics, you, the jury, the investigator, to give you an idea, is this a significant match or not? A 1 in 5, that's meaningless. You, as an attorney, should ask your analyst to explain the fact that that means lots of other people, if also tested, we would also not exclude. If your stats are 1 in greater than the population of the Earth, well then that is more meaningful, that it's less likely to match someone other than the person that it is being compared to. So I wanted to share some of the ways that the FBI has disclosed this information. Sounds like some of you guys were already aware of the issue. Bless you. They initially published that erratum in May of this year. There have been media reports. They've amended the PopStats database. PopStats is the software that we labs use to do our calculations. They've issued bulletins to all the NDIS participating labs. An NDIS participating lab is a lab like HFSC. It's a laboratory that submits DNA profiles to the National DNA Index System, or CODIS. They've issued information at FBI.gov, and the amended data has been made publicly available so that if a defense expert wanted to do a recalculation, they would have access to that information as well. And so this is, I know, really hard to read. I'm very sorry. I wanted to give you guys some examples and perspective on when we recalculated the cases within my laboratory, what was the impact on the casework? And so I'll read some of them to you. If we redid a single source DNA profile, and those are going to be the samples that yield those really, really high statistics.
Single source is just, there's just one contributor.
Thank you, yes.
Okay.
Single source means we're detecting only one individual, and so the statistics tend to be very, very strong. In our first example of data at every single location, meaning it's a full profile, our initial conclusion was for the Caucasian race was approximately 1 in 4.3 septillion. When we recalculated it, it went to 4.4 septillion. Okay, not significant in my opinion. For a complete DNA mixture.
It is a reasonable doubt.
Well, in that example, it actually the number went higher. In some cases, the numbers are going slightly lower. In a similar amount, we're also seeing them go slightly higher. But bottom line is if we're using the same information in the first calculation as the second calculation, there's not a significant difference. What we're going to talk about more later is when we don't use the same information, and I'm going to get into that. But when you're using the same DNA profile, it's really insignificant, in my opinion. In an example of a mixture, and I'm sorry, I can't read this. For Caucasians, 1 in 100 million. When we recalculated it, it was 1 in 99 million.
Okay. So these results didn't matter really. What led to what we're going to talk about didn't really amount to much, is that?
Correct.
Okay.
So the issue itself was seemingly not a significant issue in the community. However, we immediately, our laboratory, the day we got notice from the FBI, notified our biggest client, which is the Harris County District Attorney's Office, and said, hey, we have this issue. We'll be happy to recalculate statistics as needed. And they said, thank you very much. And so we thought, okay, we'll just, on a case-by-case basis, we'll recalculate these statistics. But what we discovered is some cases that maybe were not issued recently, but maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, when we went and re-examined the data, our interpretation protocol might have evolved. And so I would interpret a profile slightly differently now than I would have 3, 4, 5 years ago. And if I'm issuing a report today, I need to use my current protocol in my laboratory. And so what we were finding is in some cases, we might actually approach the sample slightly differently. And by the way, this is not a local HFSC issue or even local to the community or the state. This is a nationwide problem, or international really. We realized, hey, we might be getting different conclusions. And so I'm going to talk more about this. But I wanted to share with you, Bob mentioned the Texas Forensic Science Commission has really taken a leadership role in trying to address this and try to understand the scope of the issue, the magnitude of the issue. And on their website, they issued a letter that is saying, look, when labs went and recalculated, it might be that their protocols changed, and so you might have slightly different interpretations. And they recommend that any prosecutor or defense attorney or defendant that has a case that is pending prosecution contact the lab and see if reinterpretation might be warranted in your particular case. And you might be asking yourself, well, why are there changes? Why is your protocol changing? A couple of things I do think it's worth mentioning is the type of sample we're being asked to test is changing. 20 years ago, it was a blood stain or a sample from a sexual assault kit that had 2 contributors. But now we're being asked to test any and everything, and we're testing, this rail that might have 16 different people on it. So the interpretation is becoming more complex because the samplers are becoming more complex. But also, our technology is getting better. Our kits are getting more sensitive. I think we're seeing more mixtures now because the kits that we use to amplify the DNA or test the DNA are more sensitive. We're picking up these people. It's not that they weren't necessarily there before when the samples were tested. It's just that the chemistry didn't pick them up. And so I think we're seeing more complex samples based on what we're being asked to test, but also the nature of the technology. And so this is a lot of words, and I'm very sorry. What this slide talks about are all the efforts that the Texas Forensic Science Commission is attempting to explore. Like Bob mentioned, they're putting together panels that include practitioners in the laboratories, but defense attorneys, prosecutors. And so
you would think the world is coming to an end. I mean, you wouldn't believe the urgency that they view this. And Barbara Hervey of the Court of Criminal Appeals and various other people. It's going to be, we don't know how serious it's going to be when all is said and done, but it's wide, it's vast. There are tens of thousands of cases. Right. So anyway, I'm sorry.
No, and I think, and I'm going to list some of the things they're trying to explore, but I think the take-home message that I really want you guys to take away is that right now they're really just trying to understand the magnitude of the problem. How big is this? How many cases does this impact? And so some of the issues that they're looking into are prosecutor constitutional and state law disclosure obligations. What resources, or can we identify resources and funding sources? Because keep in mind, as laboratories are being asked to go back and recalculate old cases, the new cases haven't stopped coming in. So there's that issue where the labs are going to be stretched to try to address this. Should there be a retroactive case review? How and why? What are the scientific and technology challenges? Trying to identify education and training needs and possible resources to ensure current and proper protocols. The implications of moving to probabilistic genotyping and how to successfully transition to that. Which stakeholders to include in the process and how to best communicate the issues. Should there be frequently asked questions, webinars, in-person meetings, et cetera. And then And I'm going to touch on that later. So, what subcommittees and task force need to be. So really that's what they're trying to put together right now, and just really to understand the magnitude.
If I could interject, I'll just give you one example of the problem, and you can imagine how enormous this is. We're going to talk about notification. The DA's office is very gun-shy these days, and we want them to be that way, about having to notify the defense of everything that happens. So here you have a problem where we've got tens of thousands of cases. I mean, we're going to have potentially 10, 15,000 in Harris County, right? So the DA's office, you remember how John Healy out in Fort Bend was held accountable because he did not send out a Brady notice on one of the Salvador cases, one of the drug analyst cases, quickly enough. So what do you think that leaves prosecutors here and around the state thinking they have to do? Well, they're sending out notification letters now. They're not going to wait on the recalculated results to see if it's likely to make a difference. They're just going to send out these notifications to everybody, right? But then, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to have to recalculate the results in a test, and then what? Then you have to send out the results, right? It's like, well, and you get these clients, that you'll have in prison saying, oh my God, with the first letter, I knew I was innocent. And then they get the second letter, and it's sort of like telling your kids, we're not going to Chuck E. Cheese tonight. It's like, without having said anything before. Yeah, but the notification problem itself, think about how you find clients. Think about the difficulty in finding clients, especially from a few years back. With the people we generally represent, they're easy to find if they're in prison, but otherwise, it's very difficult. Do you send them certified mail? They're going to run from certified mail, especially if it's from the DA's office. Is constructive notice okay? Just post it on some listserv or something? That's not good enough, right? Who's to say all lawyers are part of every listserv and that they're going to report it to their client anyway? Send it to the last known attorney of record? Well, that's not going to work. I mean, if I'm not getting paid, I might just toss it, Jim?
The DA's office taking their responsibility to notify the defendant, or are they just notifying us, passing the buck to us? It's our responsibility to find it.
Well, have you gotten any notice letters? I have. Our office has gotten a few from the DEA, and what's interesting with the notification is they send out this letter. The DAs are required to think, well, how much do we need to tell them? How quickly do we need to send this out? So they're erring on the side of extreme caution by sending all this complicated stuff that I don't understand about, with the tables and whatnot. And you can imagine a poor client in some prison unit getting this and trying to make sense of it. I can't make sense of it. And so the language itself is very confusing. The DA's office is just including all this and sending it out first of all pending cases, and then they've got a protocol where they start with pending trial cases, and then they send it, I think, to, cases involving death row inmates. And then there's this, they want to take care of the live ones. But then we're going to go, as Robin said, we're going to move to reviewing old DNA cases. Can you imagine the magnitude of that and how you go about it? Like, we're going to take these 50,000 or 25,000 DPS cases. I guess the first way to pare it down is how many of these cases resulted in a prosecution. This is a hard project to even, get your head around as to coming up with the cases that might really amount to something. So, I mean, Robin has some ideas, I hope, about how to do that, because I'm going to have to be involved in this. And, I just can't imagine the magnitude that we're going to deal with. But I'm sorry.
No. So, I hope this is good news to you guys. The Texas Forensic Science, oh, yes, ma'am.
When you talk about, you're just talking about reclassifying the numbers, but you're not talking about retesting the samples.
Correct. Correct. The data is the data. The data won't change.
What you talk about is testing being more sensitive now, looking at mixtures that previously weren't, but y'all aren't going back with new testing, couple of gaps.
Not correct. Correct. The commission they're not only putting these panels together, but they're inviting international leaders in the forensic community to try to help get our heads around this issue. So a couple of gentlemen, Dr. Mike Coble and Dr. John Butler from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. There's Dr. Fred Bieber from Harvard Medical School. There's John Buckleton, who's from New Zealand. And who am I forgetting? Oh, Dr. Bruce Bedoli, who's from the University of North Texas Genetics Institute. So these are pretty big names in the community, and they're trying to help us understand this issue. And I think what's also important to notice is that Texas is sort of taking the lead on this. Other states are kind of sitting back and waiting to see how's Texas going to handle this before they take action. So I think that is a good thing.
May I interject something there? Just in case you didn't know, and I didn't realize the truth of this. I went to Boston 2 weeks ago on a symposium with all these, they let me come watch, but they had all these big names like Barry Scheck, Peter Neufeld, they had people from Stanford and Harvard. It was an actual innocent symposium celebrating 25 years since the first exoneration. And I want you to know, it was a big deal I want you to know that from the introductory speaker on, it was peppered with mention to doing things the way they do it in Texas. And we are like at the forefront of forensic progress. And you know, I had heard about this from some people who had a reason to put it that way, but then I went up there and I heard all these people saying, here's how they do it in Texas, here's the way, that's the way you should do it. Texas has a forensic science commission, they're on top of all this, we're all looking to see how they do it. It's really incredible how true that is. So,
oh, thank you.
And she's a part of it, yeah.
So I promised the definitions page before I get into some of the science stuff. Like I mentioned, an allele, when I talk about that, that's just that information at a location that you either got from your mom or your dad, and it varies in the population. A DNA profile is a combination of all that genetic information into one profile. So when I talk about a unique DNA profile, that's the information gained at each location I tested for that individual or that sample. Allelic dropout. Allelic dropout is very important with this issue because with mixtures, we're talking about samples that aren't maybe the best quality. Not only are you dealing with multiple individuals, but you're dealing with not a complete set of information. So if we test a sample, we might not always get information at every location tested because the sample might be very low level. Maybe it's old, it's degraded from age. Maybe it was cleaned up at the crime scene, who knows? But there's not enough DNA there to get a full profile. So we might see what we call allelic dropout, where we're just not getting the information that might be there.
Let me see if tell me if this is right, because I'm going to have to explain this to other people. So when you're looking at the alleles that go up, there's a question first as to whether they go high enough
Correct.
To reach the level. And there's also a question as to whether it's too faded to count. Is that fair? I mean, they're not strong enough of a I don't know, they just don't appear strong enough?
The fade issue, I think, would be more with the older technology, that image I showed on the left-hand side of the staining. With what we're looking at, it has more to do with the intensity of the peak. How high is the peak? And we're going to talk about thresholds. But yeah, basically, does it exceed this first threshold that says, hey, it's probably DNA versus background noise? And then there's a second threshold we call a stochastic threshold, and I'm going to talk more about that. But is this high enough for us to feel confident that we're not missing information? In other words, if you're getting activity this high, that's probably all the information that's there. But if you have activity that's very low and close to the baseline, it could be that there's other information there that you're just not picking up because it's low level, it's degraded, it's inhibited, whatever. Does that help? Somebody, well, I started, so I'll continue. Maybe I should save it for another slide, but Bruce Badoli gave the analogy of the stochastic threshold of it's like when the radio's on, but it's not loud enough. You can hear that there's music, but you don't know if you're hearing all the words. But when it's loud enough, if it exceeds that threshold, you know you're hearing all the words of that song. But before it exceeds that threshold, you might be missing something, or you might hear, you know, we are going to war versus we're not going to war. You know, it might have a totally different meaning for you if you're not getting all that information.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
This is not something that can be resolved statistically. If you don't know whether you can drop out or not, is that correct?
Well, no, actually, and I'm going to talk about that, but it does matter because what's happening is that if you think you have dropout, then that information is not suitable for statistics. But before laboratories established that stochastic threshold, they might have just used the data that was collected, the data that was detected. And so now having this threshold, we might go back and say, the information's not high enough. We should not have used that location for statistics. If I go back and I have to take out some of my locations for statistics, first what's going to happen is my statistics are going to go lower. When the fewer locations I use, the less information I have, the stats are going to go lower. But it might go so low to the point where we're saying, I can't use any of this data. So I'm going from a statistic of a weak statistic, 1 in 50, to I shouldn't draw conclusions. This data is uninterpretable. So that's, in my opinion, the most dramatic change we're seeing is that we're going from a weak statistic to no conclusions. We're not seeing he's included and now he's excluded. We're not seeing that.
Although I was with a prosecutor at the Forensic Science Commission meeting a couple of weeks ago, and he's an elected prosecutor, and he had asked his first assistant to submit a mixed DNA result to be recalculated. Initially, at trial, the results had been that this DNA profile appears 1 out of every 1.8 billion times. Okay, so they convicted the guy. And he got the results as we were there, and this may be an anomaly, I don't know, but the new results were, no, 1 in 38 times. So I don't know, and it might have just been a lucky, first testing, but I don't know if you're going to see that many dramatic results like that, but it's possible, I guess. Yep. Yep.
I think in that instance, I'm aware of it. The situation was the laboratory, it wasn't our lab. The laboratory used a lot of the locations, and so their statistics represented a lot of data. But then when they went back and applied that threshold, they reduced the number of locations they could use for statistics, and so the stats went significantly lower.
Are the DAs going to concede to this new method of recalculation as being more appropriate or kosher? I mean, are they going to say, well, you're looking at all sorts of stuff that's really irrelevant? I mean, how conceded is this going to be between the parties as to the science part?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think that the Commission's trying to answer that question because just yesterday, in fact, all the laboratories in the state of Texas were asked to not only provide their protocols going back to when they brought STRs online, which for some labs could be the late 1990s, but they're also asking for casework to be examined by a panel of experts, those experts we talked about, to try to understand, and so everybody can agree, okay, the application used by this lab now is good. In this time frame, it wasn't, so let's look at those cases in that time frame. So I think they're trying to get a handle on what is acceptable.
And might we also see people whose numbers go up so that it's more likely that they were the perpetrator?
It's possible. I think for mixtures, it's less likely, not impossible. I think for like the examples I gave you, the single source profiles, I think you're going up, but not significantly, I think. The last concept I wanted to sort of define before getting into the science is validation. And the reason this is important is because I get asked a lot, why doesn't the FBI just tell every lab what threshold to use? Can't every single lab have the same analytical and stochastic thresholds? And I'm going to talk about those. But the reason I bring this up is because DNA laboratories that are accredited are bound by the FBI's quality assurance standards. You probably hear us talk about that when we testify.
What was the last one?
The FBI's quality assurance standards. And so when a laboratory is accredited, their accrediting body says you have to meet all these standards. But for DNA labs, they have all these standards plus the FBI standards. And the FBI tells laboratories you must validate your procedures before you apply it to casework. We want to make sure it's a good, robust system before we start using it on casework. But we also need to establish the parameters within which we should operate. How sensitive is this test? At what point is the data unreliable because we overload it with information? All those sorts of questions get answered within your validation. And because labs have to do an internal validation, you might have different thresholds at different laboratories. In my experience, we're all very similar, but we're not necessarily exactly the same. And it's because of that validation issue where we have to do our own validation. Our instruments in our hands, in our laboratory, dictates the parameters within which we operate and interpret data. So another picture that I thought would be helpful, but it's kind of hard to see, I'm sorry. So what is a DNA mixture? A DNA mixture is any sample where we're detecting more than one individual in that DNA profile. This is really not good, sorry. On the picture on the left-hand side is showing you what a single source profile looks like, and I'll try to describe it as much as I can. A single source profile, like we said before, is DNA from one individual. When I look at a DNA sample, I'm looking at those peaks, those allele peaks. At any location, if I see 1 or 2 peaks, no more than 2 peaks, I can be confident this is from one person, right? Because your mom gave you one, your dad gave you one. You can't have more than 2 from one individual. In some cases, mom and dad gave the same information, so you might see 1 peak. But when we're looking at mixtures, that's our first thing is we know it's a mixture when we see more than 2 peaks at a location. On a single source profile, is it possible that there's somebody there below threshold that we're not picking up? Sure, all the time. Whenever you hear us report this is a single source profile, what we're telling you is the data we detected is from one individual.
But as I'm understanding, if you had just 2 peaks, there might be 2 that didn't get over the barrier, the stochastic level or whatever it's called, so that maybe there is more than 1 person, right?
It's possible. And so what we do is we look at our baselines and we look for that activity that is it there, but it's just not high enough to be detected.
And could it be the case that what's tested in one lab may not go above that line, but if you took it to another lab, it would be considered?
It's possible. It is.
That seems like some fertile ground for cross-examination. It's like, so it's just sort of arbitrary that you say there's 1 person or 2 people, but if we took it over to this other lab with a different level, we'd have a different result. I mean, it just seems, you know, to the uneducated on this, like that's a possibility.
Well, and let me clarify. I mean, when it's a mixture, yes, the different thresholds could result in different alleles being detected. But generally, with a single source profile, it's pretty clear it's single source. There's just no activity on the baseline. You see the 2 peaks, they're really significant being called. I don't think you really are going to run into that issue. If we say it's single source, we're just not picking up anybody else. I say that it's possible somebody else is there because I want you to be aware of the fact that once the ratio of one contributor to the other is 20 times or more, that major contributor just masks the other person. Doesn't mean they're not there, it just means we can't detect them. So the data I'm seeing is from one individual. But the image on the right-hand side is a mixture profile. And I don't know if you can tell, but at some of the locations, you're seeing up to 5 different alleles. So as an analyst, and I look at this is a mixture, the first thing I look at is try to determine how many people are present. If I have 5 alleles at one location, I know I have at least 3 contributors, right? Because if I assume one person gave 2, another person gave 2, that still means there's a third person. Could be 5 people, right? Because if they all just gave 1 allele, it could be up to 5 people. So when we interpret this profile, we would say at least 3 contributors because we know we were dealing with at least 3. It could be more. But one of the things I wanted to point out is and I wish you could see it better. There are some locations that have 5, but there are some locations that only have 2. So that means that there's what we call allele sharing. So you have at least 3 people, because at least one location there was 5 alleles detected. But at the locations that you're only seeing 2 or 3 alleles, what that's telling you is that the people had the same information and they're sharing. And so we might only see 2 or 3 peaks, but the peak intensity, if it's 2 people contributing to the peak, it goes higher than if it was just that 1 person. So these are all issues that is required for an analyst to look at for mixture interpretation. That's why this is such a complicated issue, and that's why you might have slightly different interpretation from lab to lab. It's not black and white.
It's not black and white, and I don't know about you, but I always thought of DNA, at least vis-a-vis other scientific disciplines, as being more objective, that it's sort of instrument-based, and the analyst is pretty much just feeding stuff in and you get results. And it sounds to me like there's some subjective input on the part of the analyst, such that, I don't know, 2 analysts from the same lab, could they come up with different conclusions? Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? I would say no. Now that labs have these stochastic thresholds where we're quantifying, look, you can't even look at this data if it's not at a number, I think that creates more uniformity within a laboratory. So this one, I think you can see a little better. So this is a made-up sample. It's something that you might see on an allele chart in a DNA report that we would issue. The first column are the locations I've tested. Those are just the markers of DNA that we're testing. The second column is a red-brown stain from a car. Made that up. But what you can see is at multiple locations, there are more than 2 alleles, right? So I'm dealing with a mixture. Up to 4 alleles I think is the maximum. The third column, I have the complainant's DNA profile, and the fourth, I have the suspect. So as an analyst, when I get this this profile from the red-brown stain from the car, after I decide I have the best DNA profile possible, that I can't amp the sample again to get more data. If I decide this is the data I have and this is what I'm working with, I'm going to then compare it to my known sources of DNA. And so in this fabricated example, every single allele that's in your mixture of the evidence sample is explained by the complainant and the suspect. All of their alleles are exactly replicated in that mixture. And so I can never tell you how that stain got there, right? But I can tell you, based on the DNA information, that
this DNA data supports the fact that one explanation is that this is a mixture of the victim and the suspect, because there's no information addition to their profiles, and there's nothing less of their profiles. This mixture is perfectly explained by these two individuals. But at the end of the day, that's just one explanation of how that profile got there, right?
Let me ask something. The numbers come from where exactly? Does a machine spit out a number, or does it spit out a visible zigzag, peak?
The peak.
And then you assign the number.
It's software based. We do not assign numbers. That would be hard.
Yeah.
But no, it's soft. So the information is detected on an instrument called a genetic analyzer, and we apply analysis software. A genetic analyzer. And analysis software is used to take that electrical signal and convert it into something that I as a human can read and understand. And it would be the same at any laboratory using that software. So in this example, is this a pointer?
Let me stop you. Do
Yeah.
all the labs use the same software?
Bless you. I believe so. I'm not aware of labs that don't use the applied biosystem software. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any correlation between specific physical characteristics and the loci? Or
That is a great question. No. I cannot look at someone's DNA profile and tell you anything about that individual, except male or female. They specifically chose regions of DNA that you can't mate for. In other words, I can't, because right, if we assume it's possible that a tall person's more likely to mate with a tall person, we don't want to use genetic information that would cause variation within the frequencies of the data. So this is, all the information that we test for is completely unrelated to any physical characteristics or any other characteristics. Really, it's sometimes referred to as junk DNA because it's DNA that we all carry, but it doesn't code for anything. It doesn't code for proteins, or it doesn't cause any result in your body. So no, you wouldn't. I can't look at somebody and say they probably have a 9.9. I just wouldn't know that.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. She asked if there was a correlation between those numbers, that genetic information, and physical characteristics, and the answer is no. It's a very good question. So in my perfect little example here, where I have data at every location, so this isn't a degraded sample. When I'm comparing the complainant, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at her information and see is her 16, 17 in that sample at that location? Yes. And so then I'm going to go down at every single location. And if at any one location her information doesn't match what's in the evidence, I'm going to exclude her. She doesn't match, if I assume I have all the information. But at the end, when I get to the bottom, all of her alleles are represented. So I'm going to conclude she cannot be excluded. I'm not saying it's her. I'm just saying she can't be excluded based on this data. I then do the same thing with the suspect. I look at every single location. If his information is represented in that evidence sample, I cannot exclude him. So that's my conclusion. And if I'm going to draw a conclusion of saying I cannot exclude someone, you're not likely to hear us say include. You're going to say we can either exclude definitively or we cannot exclude. If I'm going to say I cannot exclude someone, I must then provide statistics to give you significance of that match. I can't say someone's not excluded but not give you a meaning or weight to that conclusion. And so I want to talk a lot about what Bob referred to earlier, the CPI, the combined probability of inclusion. The reason I'm going to talk about this statistic is because this is the most commonly used statistic locally but nationwide, and this is part of what is the source of the issue here, this mixture interpretation. So a CPI is a calculation that looks at a mixture, and so on that mixture, that first location where you're seeing a 10, a 15, a 16, a 17, it's going to look at that profile, and regardless of what the suspect's profile is, it's going to calculate all the possible combinations of those 4 alleles and do a statistic on that. So in other words, it's going to allow for the fact that I could have a 10-10, a homozygous, somebody who mom and dad gave a 10, a 15-15, a 16-16, a 17-17, a 10-15, a 10-16, a 10-17, et cetera. All the possible combinations. The frequency of those, it says all of these people, if you had any one of those combinations, you could be included. If one or both of your alleles is not in this mixture, then you couldn't have contributed. So the question it answers is, what percentage of the population would not be excluded from this mixture? It does not care the number of contributors, and it doesn't care about what the suspect's known profile is. and I'm going to talk about that more, some statistics will specifically look at the suspect's known DNA to make that inference.
Let me ask you a question that was brought
Sure.
up when I went to the symposium about the calculation part of this versus, I don't know, doing whatever leads to the calculation's done through some sort of programming, obviously. You don't sit down with, you know,
Correct.
with a handheld computer. So could you object to an expert testifying to these sorts of numbers on the basis that they have no real knowledge of how those numbers are reached, or were they just plugged it into some system, some device, you know,
Well,
software that you have?
hopefully your analyst can explain it. We make our analysts do it by hand in training so that they understand the logic behind it, so they're not on the stand unable to explain it. But you're right, we don't do it by hand because that would, I mean, a potential for error, the time it would take. But yeah, no, they should be able to explain to you the logic behind the calculation. We just don't manually do the calculation. But the probabilistic genotyping, humans can't do that. It's very, very complex algorithms, and it requires software that take sometimes days to do the calculation. I mean, it's really complex stuff. So those are going to be harder for analysts to explain on the stand, I would think. So anyway, I mentioned, so this model asks what portion of the population will not be excluded, and it assumes all alleles are present. And the reason I want to make this point is, like we kind of alluded to earlier, the issue is that labs were maybe using locations in their calculation where they might have been missing data. And now that they go back and realize, I don't have all the information, I should not have used this for a calculation, now that locus is not suitable for statistics. So again, we're not seeing he was included, now he's excluded. We're saying his information's there. He's included because the genetic information makes sense. I can't exclude him. But because I can't do stats to back it up, I can no longer say I cannot exclude. I can't make that conclusion of not excluded because I can't back it up with statistics. And so kind of to give you a little background on why this has changed, in 2010, SWIGDAN, the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods, set out a set of guidelines that specifically try to address the issue of mixture interpretation to get labs nationwide more on the same page. The problem is, it wasn't like we could flip a switch and say, okay, tomorrow we're going to start doing this. Like I said, we have to do those validations in-house. So some labs, it took, you know, the guidelines came out in 2010, but the changes have since been implemented, but it wasn't overnight. And so locally, I can tell you, all the labs, the DPS, the Harris County, and our laboratory now have what we call a stochastic threshold, which we'll talk about. But it didn't all happen at the same time. And so this impact of how long ago is going to vary from laboratory to laboratory. We brought on our stochastic threshold in 2012 when we brought on a new chemistry. But I want to point out, I do think this is important. Even before we had a technical statistical threshold, a threshold at which we said, hey, this data is good because it reached or exceeded this value. If we saw data below threshold, we would exclude that locus from the calculation. So we sort of had a functional equivalent of a stochastic threshold, but technically we did not have a stochastic threshold. So I think in those instances, in cases that were tested with that chemistry, we have some options. We could retest it with new chemistry so that we do have a stochastic threshold. But I do think, I suspect that when you go back and look at a lot of those, the spirit of the stochastic threshold was honored, and so it might not be a significant difference when you recalculate. But that remains to be seen until we see the data. Okay, I keep talking about analytical and stochastic threshold. So I kind of mentioned it earlier. The analytical is the point at which we're saying this is not background noise, this is real DNA activity. And the stochastic is that higher threshold that says you're not missing any information. So the image on the left-hand side, I have 4 peaks. You can't really see it, but there are 2 lines. The bottom line is the analytical threshold. The top line is stochastic. All the peaks are above that. So if I look at this profile, this location is suitable for statistics because I'm not missing any information. So that one's good to go. The one in the middle, you might have heard analysts talk about a mixture of DNA with a major and a minor component. Sometimes we have, the people who contributed their DNA did not contribute it in similar proportions. It's possible that somebody contributed much more than the other person. And when we can see that significant signal intensity difference, we can say these peaks are from one person, these peaks are from another person. We can distinguish that. And so that middle one shows a major minor component. And something, just FYI, when we can distinguish a major contributor and separate them out from the profile, we can apply single source statistics to that major component. So some of these mixtures, it's going to be a non-issue because it was a mixture, but it had a major component where we did single source statistics. And so the stochastic threshold doesn't apply. The example on the right is the one line I have is my analytical threshold of 50 RFUs. Those peaks are close to it and below it. That's not good data. We should not be using that in our interpretation. But I think in the example you gave of the 1.8 billion to 38, I suspect the lab might have used maybe just those peaks that were above the line, and even though there was that activity present that was below the line, and perhaps that locus should not have been used in the calculation.
Okay, let me jump ahead because I've been interrupting too much. But I know one question some of us may be wondering is, so what are we going to get when we ask you to recalculate one of these? Are we going to get a report that says upon original submission the results were X, now the results are whatever?
What our reports are, they will indicate at the top of the report that it is amended, and it'll indicate what changes were made. So it'll say if it was just statistical calculation or if there was also an interpretation difference. So that would be indicated on the report.
Are we going to be able to see those peaks too?
That's in the case file, and I'm happy to say that now our reports invite anybody to seek from the laboratory a copy of the case file. So that information is available to you, but the question was, are you going to be able to see those peaks? And so those peaks are within the case records, and so it's part of the case file that we're willing to share with anybody. So you'll see in our reports now, they do say at the bottom, please contact the lab if you want more information on that case file.
And also, you were talking about baselines, and you said something about, you mentioned that a lab and the baseline might be different. If there's not an established baseline, I mean, does it move around from lab to lab?
No, the baseline would be, the question is would the baseline change? Now, the baseline is zero. You know, there's nothing, and then you go from there. And so
And everybody operates on the same baseline.
right. I mean, the instruments, they can't, they start at zero. There's no negative to the detection.
I think I meant the stochastic level or whatever might change from lab to lab.
Right. Yeah.
Charlie probably has a lot of mixture cases.
I think any case, whether it's any case, whether it's being recalculated or not, I think it's worth having a second pair of eyes. But should you? I don't know if I can answer that.
Well, if you get a notice, that doesn't mean you're necessarily recalculating it, right? That has to be requested specifically.
Well,
Unless on trial cases, yeah, okay.
yeah. I mean, we've already received over 200 requests that we're about 75% through recalculating on those.
Let's put your website.
Yeah.
You've invited people to go ahead and submit cases, right?
Yes. So if you have a case that you would like to resubmit, please contact the laboratory. We can tell you if it even applies to your case. I mean, some of the requests from the DA's office, they gave us a list of more than 200, but a lot of them, there were no stats to begin with, right? So they didn't apply. So we can tell you if it applies, and we'll either do it for you, or we'll give you the copy of the amended report that's already been issued because it was already requested.
So the forensic, I mean, I don't want to invite you to just call her on her private line, but they've been very, very helpful in complying with any requests we've had for information, education, or whatever. So they're a tremendous resource, and I hope you'll take advantage of it.
Well, and I do want to invite you guys, now that we are independent of the Houston Police Department, if you need pre-trial conference, you have a question about a case, contact us. I mean, it used to be that it would sort of go through the DA's office, or we would, make sure they knew you contacted us. We're open to both parties, so if there are any questions about your case, please contact us. There are no problems with that at all.